It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP and Party Vice Chair Andrew Bowie, Shadow Culture Secretary Joe Stevens, Scotland's Finance Secretary and SNP candidate Kate Forbes, and the Daily Telegraph's Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Coming up on the programme.
For centuries, humanity has been quilting our planet in a toxic tea cosy of greenhouse gases.
That was Boris Johnson 4 months ago. Now he's getting serious as he announces stricter emissions targets. What does it mean for us? Also today...
The Super League have chucked a grenade at the Premier League and chucked a grenade to everyone else. Well, chuck one back. Ban them.
Politicians are also talking tough about plans for a European Football Super League. But can they do anything about it? And we speak to Scotland's Finance Secretary about the SNP's independence plans. Let's start with this story that's covered in the Daily Telegraph, amongst other papers. Do more to help young and poor non-Tory voters hit by the pandemic, centrist Conservative MPs urge. Well, this is the story that everyone should be given between the ages of 18 and 24, a £500 lump sum as the age group amongst those worst affected by the pandemic. So says a group of 100 Tory MPs led by former Cabinet Minister Damian Green. Should the government do it, Andrew?
Well, look, it's a very interesting proposal, and there can be no doubt that the age group that we're talking about has been the worst affected by the pandemic and subsequent lockdown.
So yes or no?
Well, it's something that we'll consider all options in terms of supporting the youngest.
Yes, I know, Andrew, but saying it's interesting and that you'll consider all options is something all politicians say about pretty well everything. So is it a goer or not?
Well, it's a report that's only been published this morning by an eminent group of Conservative MPs, of which I am a member of the One Nation group, so I would say that. And I think that the government should consider this, as well as all the other options. Look, we are investing heavily in supporting those most affected by the pandemic and subsequent lockdown. And as I said, there can be no doubt that this group in particular, be that people in further or higher education entering the workplace, who have had their dreams shattered and their lives put on hold. So we should be looking at any and all options in terms of supporting them and considering all of these suggestions that are coming thick and fast to the government right now. Right,
Joe, would it get your vote?
Well, I think certainly the government needs to do something for young people. We saw the ONS published statistics about drop in payroll between March 2020 and 2021. 813,000 people have come off payroll, and nearly half of those are people under 25. Now, whether or not the equivalent of a gift voucher for 500 is the right thing to do, I'm not sure. What we do need, and what Labour has proposed, is a jobs promise equivalent to what we did in our Jobs Fund in previous years.
Right.
And that is focusing on getting young people who are unemployed back into work through targeted training and support, and particularly more for young people who are unemployed for 12 months or more.
Right. I mean, COVID relief payment, it's being called, £500. You say you're not sure. What's holding you back giving it support?
Well, I just think there are targeted strategic things that government could do. So, £500 now, I'm sure people would like that. But what actually matters, getting people back into work. Young people want to be able to get back into work. They need the skills and the training to help them get back into work. They are the hardest hit of people in terms of the economy. And the government should be doing much more targeted, and I think with strategic policy making towards group.
Kate, would you do this in Scotland?
I'll tell you what I would do with £2.8 billion, which I think is what's been suggested. I would give cash sums. I would create jobs. I would ensure that they have somewhere to stay. I would ensure that there are opportunities for education. I think young people have been the hardest hit, but I don't think it's cash giveaways that they need. What they do need is jobs and education.
Sure, but how many jobs would that help actually create, £2.8 billion?
Yeah, so, in Scotland, we've got the Young Person's Guarantee. So that guarantees every young person between the same age range, under the age of 24, either a job or an apprenticeship or an education and training opportunity. And that is the lifeline that young people need, having seen their exams disrupted, their education disrupted, and coming out the other end. They have been incredibly resilient. They have been through a really tough time. But in Scotland, there's three things that we're doing, and that's what I'd do with the money, is the young person's guarantee to ensure they have a job. We're obviously reducing costs as well for them. So increasing eligibility for council tax up to the age of 22 rather than 18 to give them a little bit more cash support, as well as ensuring they can actually get to their job or their training with extending concessionary bus travel for under 22s as well.
All right, Camilla, do you think this is a flyer?
Well, I think older people might object to the idea of handouts to the 18 to 24-year-olds when some people who have built up businesses over the course of several decades have seen them left in tatters. Equally, I suppose it's an attempt, isn't it, by the Tories to entice in younger voters. But at the same time, I remember when I had various of my children that at times government gave handouts to new mums. I think we got £500 under one government, another £150 under another for fruit and vegetables. And yet you take this money and you never really are thankful to the government that's given it to you. In fact, I can't even remember which was which. So one wonders whether these buns actually ever work.
All right, we're going to leave it there and move on to the story today around climate. Let's just show you the BBC and how they covered it by our environment analyst, Roger Harabin. Climate change, UK to speed up target to cut carbon emissions. And that's the news that the Prime Minister will say this week carbon emissions will be cut by 78% by 2035. Now, that's almost 15 years earlier than previously planned. Hitting the targets would require more electric cars, low-carbon heating, renewable electricity, and for many, cutting down on meat and dairy. Now, for the first time, climate law would be extended to cover international aviation and shipping. In a moment, we're going to speak to the Green MP, Caroline Lucas, too. But first of all, Camilla, I mean, this is quite a significant change. Why now?
Well, I think clearly senses that in line with talk of there being a climate change emergency, that this will ingratiate him with voters and make the Tories seem green and compete against the likes of Caroline and others, including the Labour Party, which is quite strong on eco issues. However, from a voter point of view, I think people are often left confused. 1 minute we're advised to buy diesels, the next we're not. We're now all being told to buy electric cars. Has the Prime Minister got an electric car? I can't imagine an electric-powered armour-coated vehicle making its way out of Downing Street very easily. So there's also an element of the government having to practice what it preaches here, surely.
Right. Andrew?
I mean, this is not about ingratiating ourselves with voters. This is about doing the right thing. We take our commitment to our climate change targets incredibly seriously, which is why we have sped up the process by which we want to reach net zero. You know, we were the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and we are increasing the pace of that. Now, we've already reduced our reliance on coal, for example, and we're moving very quickly in investing in renewables and encouraging people to buy electric cars. And you know, it's been quite a while since people have been encouraged to buy diesel cars, Camilla. But look, I understand the confusion out there. We need to be much more clear. We need to express how we are going to support people and businesses as we make this change. But it's vital that we do make this change in this year where we are hosting COP26 in the UK, in Glasgow, that we set a target for the rest of the world to follow, as we have done already, but that we step it up to the next level.
Right, Joe, what's your response? You must welcome the fact that the targets are being speeded up.
Well, targets in principle are a good thing, but what we're seeing is the changing of targets because I'm afraid the previous targets, the government weren't matching that with delivery. So, you know, no objection in principle to targets, but there has to be some action to match the rhetoric. You know, the government weren't on with their previous targets. They've done this re-announcement today and changed the dates. But we are all going to have to change the way in which we live in order to impact on climate change. We're expecting to see huge leaps in the carbon dioxide emissions later in the year as we recover from COVID. And I suspect today's announcement has probably got more to do with the fact that Joe Biden has a big climate summit this week, and maybe it's an attempt to snatch some headlines from him.
Right, Kate, do you welcome, in principle, the announcements that are going to be made this week by Boris Johnson in terms of setting even stricter targets in a quicker timescale?
I do, because it is trying to match our ambitions already in Scotland. In Scotland, our ambition was net zero by 2045. The UK was 5 years behind that. So it's good to see Boris Johnson trying to match that pace. But I do think there's great economic opportunities coming out of this. Yes, we have a duty, as Andrew said, in terms of reducing our climate change emissions. But coming out of the pandemic, looking for the new economic opportunities to create the jobs that we just talked about, ensuring that we meet our climate change ambitions, invest in renewable energy, ensure that we're meeting biodiversity targets, all of that is a way to reshape our economy. And certainly in Scotland, we saw, I think it was just a few weeks ago, announced that 97% of our electricity had been powered by renewables. Yeah. That's creating a strong supply chain, which is protecting jobs at a time when oil and gas is really struggling. Right. So I welcome the fact that Boris Johnson is sort of matching the pace, as it were, that we've seen in Scotland. But also, let's look at the economic opportunities that are coming out of it.
Right. Well, since you mention it, we're going to talk to Caroline Lucas in just a moment, because I think we've managed to establish a connection. Kate, what impact will the sorts of targets that you have set and Boris Johnson have when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels on your economic plan for independence, for example, because there just won't be the revenues from oil, from North Sea oil, in order to fund public services?
Yeah, and we've already started making that transition. So oil and gas being hit hard by the pandemic, we put in place an energy transition fund to help us retain the skills that are there in the oil and gas industry, but redeploy it into renewables so that we protect the skills here in Scotland. But a few years ago, we published the Growth Commission that looked at the economy in an independent Scotland. And it very much looked at oil as a bonus rather than a core foundation part of our economy in the event of independence, that we would actually try and set up a sovereign wealth fund of sorts, a fund for future generations, we called it. So it's not essential to the future thriving of our economy. And if you look at some of the revenue figures for Scotland, onshore revenues are increasing, powered in part by renewables, hydro, wind, and otherwise. As I said already a minute ago, it's creating jobs right now. Okay. We're saving some of the skills that we've had in the oil and gas industry and redeploying that.
Well, we're going to come to what changes people really are prepared to make in just a minute, but I think we have Caroline Lucas. Caroline, do you welcome Boris Johnson's expected announcement, 15 years earlier than previously planned, cutting carbon emissions by 78% by 2035?
Well, clearly I support the strengthening of the targets. That's positive news. But where there's a big gaping hole is the fact that there is still no policies to deliver this new target. We're not even meeting our existing much weaker targets. And so I think there's a massive credibility gap. And quite frankly, Boris Johnson can't just keep setting new targets and thinking that's enough, while at the same time, for example, he's pursuing a £27 billion road building programme, when he is scrapping the Green Homes Grant. This was a really key grant to help people retrofit their homes, insulate their homes. We know that Britain has some of the most leaky energy efficiency when it comes to our homes in Europe. So we have to have the delivery mechanism, we have to have the policies to be able to deliver these better targets.
Right. Why, Andrew Bowie, has the government completely scrapped the Green Homes Grant?
Well, look, we are looking at all.
Yeah, but why have you scrapped that if that was actually going to help towards insulating homes?
Because we're looking at ways that we can actually do it better and get better value for money and actually increase the pace at which we meet our climate change targets. You know, we're going to leave no stone unturned in terms of what we want to do to ensure that we meet our climate change targets and drive down our carbon emissions. And it's a shame that Caroline can't bring herself to welcome the announcements this morning. I mean, you know, our 10-point plan.
Well, she did welcome the announcement. What she was saying is, where are the policies to actually deliver it?
We've announced a 10-point plan for driving our emissions down and investing in new green jobs. We've got a £16 billion transition deal with the offshore oil and gas industry, primarily based in the northeast of Scotland, to transition from fossil fuels into new green energy. We're encouraging, and we're going to be looking at how we can support people and businesses into investing in renewables and electric cars, and discouraging people from buying diesel and petrol cars. And all of this is going to be coming down the line, as well as new initiatives for ensuring that new houses have better insulation. All of that and more.
Caroline, Caroline, that's true, isn't it? There have been big moves made.
I mean, Andrew can list as many points as he likes, but the bottom line is the government's The government's 10-point plan that was announced to such fanfare last year, scientists and experts have looked at it and says it doesn't even come halfway towards meeting the emissions gap. So even if government did everything on its 10-point plan, we still would only be about halfway towards meeting the gap in our emissions. In other words, the gap between the trajectory that we're currently on and the emission cuts we have to make. His explanation about the Green Homes Grant was frankly risible. This was supposed to be a flagship grant that was launched only late last year, that was supposed to enable people up and down the country to insulate their homes, to put in place those measures to be able to shift to low carbon energy forms. And yet the government has scrapped it practically overnight, leaving businesses high and dry, leaving homeowners and renters high and dry because they thought they were going to get these measures to make their homes warmer, and the government hasn't delivered. So I come back to the point again.
All right.
Targets are cheap. Where's the delivery?
Andrew?
Well, that's exactly why we have announced what we've announced today. The Prime Minister has announced a redoubling of our efforts. And we are at the beginning of this journey. And over the next few weeks and months, we'll be seeing many more initiatives and policies announced to help us drive down our emissions, help houses get the insulation that they need to be carbon neutral, and make sure that we lead the world when it comes to becoming the first major economy to be net zero, which we hope now will be by 2040.
All right, well, let me raise an issue with the other panellists too, looking at what all this might mean for us. If we look at domestic flights, for example, there were 42 flights a day between London and Manchester before the pandemic. These are figures from the Civil Aviation Authority. French MPs have recently voted to suspend domestic airline flights on routes that can be travelled by direct train in less than 2.5 hours. Jo Stevens, would you support that?
Well, there is a really serious issue for our aviation industry, and this is about balancing the needs of the economy to recover from COVID and obviously to protect the planet from the impact of climate change. Now, the French government have chosen to take one step on this by doing something. We need to look right across the piece, and Labour has been calling for targeted support for the aviation sector ever since the beginning of the pandemic, and we're still waiting for the government to address that.
But Jo, we need to look at...
say we can switch it. We can't just say we can switch it all off and just forget about the people who are employed in that industry.
No, but if it's a climate emergency, and it was one of the pledges of Keir Starmer in terms of tackling climate change, then where are the real policies? We're just showing, and we can show our viewers, Keir Starmer, point 3, climate justice, put the Green New Deal at the heart of everything we do. There's no issue more important to our future than the climate emergency, a Clean Air Act to tackle pollution locally, demand international action on climate rights. Part of that, hitting the targets that Caroline has mentioned, will be about cutting the amount of flights, including domestic flights. Why can't you say now that that would be a policy that you would support?
Well, we can all make personal choices about what we do and how we travel, but certainly, we have committed to a £30 billion stimulus to create green jobs. So saving the planet and reducing emissions is not just about domestic flights. There are a whole host of measures that need to be taken. And I listened to what Andrew said about what the government say they are doing in terms of their targets, but actually, that doesn't match the rhetoric, because this is a party that to open a new coal mine in Cumbria. There are no flagship schemes, and as Caroline mentioned, the very schemes that were there to reduce emissions and to control climate change, ones that have been abandoned by government.
Right, I'll come back to you in just a second. Andrew, you're shaking your head.
No, I was shaking my head at the woeful position of the Labour Party on just about every a topic at the minute. The Labour Party's position seems to be they'll wait for us to announce a policy and then they will claim it as their own as soon as we do. Specifically on the coal mine in Cumbria, as Jo knows, this has been taken into review at the present time, and the plans were anyway only designed to steel plants, which would have taken away the need to be importing coke from other countries around the world, thereby increasing carbon emissions on their journeys. But it's being reviewed as we speak. And I think when it comes to the people of Cumbria, looking at parties that are standing up for them and for jobs and for green jobs, we hear right now the Labour Party are nowhere close where the people of Cumbria need them to be.
All right, let's go back to the issue of domestic flights and actual concrete policies that are going to deliver, in part, some of the targets that you all say you support. Jo, did it send the right message when the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was seen flying to Edinburgh for a campaign visit just a few days ago? We can see pictures of him now coming off that plane.
You will see Keir travelling all over the country. You will see travelling all over the country on campaign visits. I mean, he's
should he have flown?
The most active party leader in this election
Yeah, but should he have flown?
Now,
Jo, I've just read to you. Hang on, just to be clear, I've just read to you part of what he promised in terms of climate. Should he be flying? Why didn't he take the train?
So he flew to Edinburgh because he's doing a visit to Edinburgh Airport specifically and meeting with Massoa at Edinburgh Airport. Now, you know, we can all make personal choices. Most of the time, Keir Starmer will be travelling on the train. Occasionally, he will take a flight. But we all, you know, we all have time limit on our time. We all make personal choices and we do what we can to minimise emissions wherever we can do it. So I don't think one flight on a campaign trail is something that, you know, that should have onslaught of criticism against. There will be other party leaders and many of us, for example, who don't live near London and travel to work plane. I know Andrew, for example, he claimed more than £12,000 expenses in 2019-20 flights to come to work.
Right.
Now, some people have to do that to come to work.
OK, but it is about the message. But Jo, it is about the message that it sends and how it looks to voters. I read out that, the climate claim there by Keir Starmer, making it the most important issue. And perhaps he needs to reconsider on every part of his campaign how he's going to travel.
Well, as I say, you will have identified one flight on the election campaign. Most of the time you will see Keir on trains. I've seen plenty of photographs and pictures of Keir on trains in the election campaign.
All right.
And I think that one flight in the context of that is responsible in terms of the overall picture of travel. OK,
Caroline, I mean, Jo has a point. You have got to bring people with you, haven't you? I mean, are you saying now that the Green Party would, for example, end domestic flights as soon as possible when you look at the sort of statistics I read out, 42 flights a day between London and Manchester before the pandemic this was?
Well, certainly what we think, rather than focusing on one person's particular flight at one time, what we need to look at is how we shift the whole framework. And that's why we support what's known as a frequent flyer levy, which would essentially mean that one flight that someone might take in a year would be much the same price as it is now. But as soon as you start taking 2, 3, 4 flights, then the price of that flight would ratchet massively, because we know that the vast majority of flights are taken by people who are well off. So we need to be penalising that. At the same time, I think it is right to say we should look again at where we can replace domestic aviation with rail alternatives. But I think that essentially, when we need to look at the issue, let's look at some of the systemic issues whereby aviation fuel, for example, isn't taxed. That makes no sense at all. Why are we making aviation artificially cheaper than taking the train, for example? So all right. I think individual behaviour matters. And it's interesting that the Climate Citizens Assembly of ordinary people coming together absolutely supported a frequent flyer levy. That was one of the things that they said they thought should come into place. So there's appetite for these, but let's make it a systems change.
Briefly, listening to all that, Camilla, how will this go down with voters?
I just think that voters all the time feel that they're going to be hit in the pocket for all of these government schemes, frequent flyer levies. Or what about people who've got relatives abroad that they have to visit or have to work? Not everybody is flying in first class, for business purposes. Equally, when it comes to France and this train idea, that's because the TGV and other train services in France are heavily subsidised and cheap. What person in this country, if faced with a £300 last-minute train fare to Manchester, wouldn't just drive and take a hit in 30 quid in petrol? This is the trouble. The train is often at the last minute far too expensive. And by comparison, I agree with Caroline, sometimes a flight to Edinburgh will be a lot cheaper than going by rail.
Right. Just very briefly, Caroline.
Well, I'm just saying that that's exactly what I mean by the perverse incentives that are in the system right now. We need to make rail alternatives cheaper than flying. Otherwise, it's not surprising that people will take the cheaper option.
All right, Caroline Lucas, thank you very much for joining us today. Let's move on to the ongoing row and fallout from the idea of a European Super League. In football, let's show you the headline, the Manchester Evening News front page. Shame on you. You can see some of the key club owners there on the front page. And the Liverpool Echo has this, which is what would Shanks have said? That's Bill Shankly, the legendary Liverpool football manager. Uproar as Liverpool Football Club agrees to join European Super League. The government has gone full blast on this, Camilla, but what are the options actually open to Boris Johnson and the government to stop it?
I actually think the options are really limited. I mean, Boris Johnson, of course, is coming out in support of fans because that's the right thing to do and, of course, politically expedient. But ultimately, this is down to perhaps a legal sanction by the likes of UEFA or FIFA or the FA getting together to try and combat this scheme. I would suggest, I mean, Andrew might have better ideas, that the government's going to be quite powerless. It already seems to have emerged that, you know, people have signed deals. There are a number of clubs that have signed deals to do this, to segue off, regardless of what the fans think. But then this is a consequence of successive governments, unfortunately, making it possible for the Premiership, as it transversed into the Premier League, to be ever more about money and ever less about fans. And this huge investment that's come in from owners who really have nothing to do with the beautiful game. I mean, we're all Gary Neville now, channeling our anger about this. You know, this situation was almost an inevitability when the Premier League was set up, because it suddenly became all about money and not about the intrinsic grassroots to top flight nature of the path of football that it should be. You know, to have teams in a league where they can't be relegated, frankly, completely defies the point of competitive football.
All right, Andrew, what can the government realistically actually achieve with this round table today?
Well, first, I couldn't agree more with Camilla's comments there. This is a completely code death from the big six, as they call themselves, and a case of avaricious self-interest going ahead of the game and wrenching the soul out of many of these communities.
And we've heard all of that, but what can you actually do? Camilla also said it's limited.
Well, we are supporting very much the football authorities in this country and seeking to get international action, working with the governments of Italy and Spain and UEFA and FIFA to see what we can do to ensure that this does not go ahead. I mean, the government are looking at all options, and in terms of engaging with fans more and looking at different models of how we manage the game in future. Of course, Oliver Dowden, the Secretary of State, announced a review just yesterday, something that's in our manifesto and that we felt that now is the time very much to bring forward. But we are supporting the Premier League, the FA, the Scottish Professional Football League, and all others who have expressed their disappointment and disquiet and genuine disgust at the actions of the richest clubs in our game, only seeking to make themselves richer and doing away with the core essence of football, which is the competition element, creating a competition whereby they can never be relegated. Just seems to strike at the very heart of why people love the game so much. So I'm very keen to see what exactly the government can do. And I know that as we speak, there are people in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and across government seeking to see how we can work with others to make sure that this doesn't go ahead if we can.
All right, well, let me just show you this tweet, our viewers here, from Mike Keegan. Breaking: Boris Johnson met Premier League Chief Executive Richard Masters this morning. I understand the Prime Minister said that whilst he is a staunch free marketeer, the European Super League is anti-competitive, adding we should drop a legislative bomb to stop it and we should do it now. Premier League meeting ongoing. Joe?
Well, actually, Alison, the Shadow Sports Minister, and I wrote to the Competition and Markets Authority overnight to ask them to look into an investigation into the European Super League proposal. And what it's done is managed to unite everybody across football. All those sort of tribal divides have been dropped, and everybody thinks it's a bad idea. Now, I'll be meeting, Starmer and I will be meeting with supporters trusts and fans representatives immediately after this programme, actually. And I think fans should get the front of the fight against this dreadful proposal. I think there's unity across the panel here on the programme as well. But the CMA could do something. We've asked whether they will do an investigation. We've also asked whether they can give us assistance or advise Parliament around legislation that, if it is needed, that we could put in place. Because actually what is so frustrating about this situation is that there is real consensus across Parliament about reform, the need for reform of football. We've had proposals in our last 4 manifestos about how to reform football around the ownership test, around governance and finance. And because nothing has happened, and the fan review that was promised by the government in 2019 has only just been launched yesterday, really an embarrassment of the situation of the ESL.
Okay.
That has created the vacuum for the ESL to fill. Now, had we had reform several years ago, they wouldn't have been able to do this. So we need to stop it.
Yeah.
And I think everybody is agreed that,
yes,
that needs to happen.
There's a lot of consensus around agreeing that something should be done. But Kate, some of the players for the so-called Big Six teams are Scottish players. Should they be banned from playing for the national team if this goes ahead? Players like Scott McTominay at Manchester United, Kieran Tierney at Arsenal and Andy Robertson at Liverpool.
Well, I do think the government needs to be very robust on this matter, because ultimately we've got a duty to represent the fans, and football rises or falls on the basis of the support of
should they be banned from playing? Should they be banned from playing for the national team?
I think that we should consider all options in terms of our response to this. But what I was going to say is that Camilla hit the nail on the head when she said this is about the long-term reduction in control of fans and communities. So to rectify this over the long term, it means ensuring that fans and communities have that control back again. Right. And of course, the vast majority of football has not become about greed and trying to get a bigger slice of markets. We should celebrate that. But we also need to, and it's in our manifesto, in terms of restoring some of that control to fans over the long term. And I think if you look at the backlash, I think some of those teams and some of those players perhaps will face the consequences themselves, irrespective of the measures that government takes.
Right. We've got a few problems with your sound. We can hear you, Kate. It's just sort of fading in and out a little bit. Just to be clear, though, on that issue, you say they will face the consequences. But what about taking, as you say, a robust stand? Would you support that idea of banning players from the national team if this league goes ahead, the Super League?
I mean, my preference would be not to single out players. My preference would be to take account, hold managers, owners accountable. I think, it was put well yesterday in terms of them being custodians for a period of time of those football teams. And rather than singling individuals out, I'd much rather that a club, an owner, face the consequences rather than singling individuals out.
What do you think, Andrew, about that? Would you support that?
Sorry, Joe.
The policy, the idea of banning Scottish players from playing for the national team.
Yeah, so obviously that's a position for UEFA to come to a decision about.
But do you think it would have an effect? Do you think it would have an impact?
I think what they're seeking to try and do through that is put pressure on the clubs through the individual players. There's a lot of prestige gotten by players for playing for their country, obviously, and I think that the pressure put on the clubs internally from the players who obviously want to represent their countries at the highest possible level might be, UEFA suspects, one way of putting pressure on the owners to stop this Super League from going ahead, because there might be a knock-on impact in terms of the best players in the world not then seeking to want to engage in this league if it precludes them from taking part in international competitions and playing for their country. But that's a position for UEFA. I don't think that the government has a position on that.
Joe, just very briefly, I understand you're a Spurs fan. You're due to be attending the Carabao Cup final at Wembley on Sunday. Will you boycott?
I won't boycott, because the reason why I'm going on Sunday is I want to participate in the pilot event, because it's one of the government pilot events around testing for the return of full stadia in due course. So that's why I'm going. I'll be going with a heavy heart after the events of this week, because I feel very sad as a Spurs fan. But just on that point about players not being able to play for their national team, I mean, that is an area where I suspect we'll see litigation, because as well as the fans not being consulted about this terrible proposal, the players weren't consulted either. And, they are doing their job, it's their career. And I suspect being told that they're not allowed to play for their national team is going to produce some litigation, because that'd be anti-competitive, I imagine, in itself.
Let's move on. Let's talk about Scottish independence. The former First Minister, Alex Salmond, has been speaking to our correspondent, Nick Eardley, for the PM programme on Radio 4. Here's what he says. Do you have to have a referendum? No, there are other routes to Scottish independence. Kate, does the SNP think there are other routes to independence, or only one route?
No, we think that the route to independence needs to be watertight, so that independence, when it is secured, is watertight. That means it needs to be democratic, it needs to be internationally recognised, and it needs to be legal.
Right.
And that's where we have set out the fact that getting to independence and getting a referendum is hard work.
Okay,
there are no shortcuts.
Right, so there are no shortcuts and there are no other routes, just a lawful referendum as the only route to Scottish independence.
That is what we have set out. That is how it was secured last time round when the SNP won a majority. And that is the legally and internationally recognised most watertight way of delivering independence.
OK, are you then ruling out a so-called wildcat or unlawful referendum?
Well, if you listen to my first answer, I don't think that question would be in any doubt what my answer would be.
That's clear.
If you want to live in an independent country, as I do, then the approach and the process needs to deliver that, rather than be subject to questions.
Right. Well, let's put that. Andrew, your leader in Scotland, Douglas Ross, said yesterday, that Nicola Sturgeon does want a wildcat referendum. What's the source for that?
He does. The Scottish National Party have said as much in their plan for independence. If they're not successful in getting a Section 30 order from the UK, a Section 30 order from the UK government, which would make any referendum on separation legal and binding, then they would press ahead with a wildcat referendum, which would be an illegal referendum. So I'm very interested, very intrigued to hear Kate this morning say that that's no longer the plan. I mean,
Hang on, Andrew. Where has Nicola Sturgeon said that she wants a wildcat referendum, not the referendum that we've just heard set out by Kate?
As part of their 10-point plan for independence, Mike Russell, the Constitutional Affairs Secretary, or was until he stepped down for the Scottish National Party, the Scottish Government said that this would be an option open to them if they weren't able to get a Section 30 order granted by the UK government. So the question is, if we are not going to be granting that Section 30 order, what are you saying to all of your supporters 2 weeks out from election, Kate, who are being told that to get a second independence referendum, they should be voting for the SNP if this is no longer the plan?
Kate?
On the contrary, the question to Andrew is, if not a referendum, then how does a country secure its independence? Basically, you are changing this union from a partnership based on consent, if there is support for independence, from a partnership based on consent to a position, a union that can only be secured through force of law. So the question to the Tories is, if it's not going to be a referendum when the people of Scotland unequivocally vote for one, if not a referendum, how does a country become independent?
Andrew?
Well, it might have passed Kate's notice, but it didn't pass mine that Scotland had a referendum in 2014, and the people of Scotland gave their consent to remain in the United Kingdom. That was, less than 7 years ago. And I really don't think that right now, given everything we've been talking about already, we haven't even touched on coronavirus yet in this programme, that we should be seeking to go down the rabbit hole of another damaging and divisive separation referendum, when what we should be really focusing on is rebuilding our country and recovering from one of the most damaging economic catastrophes to befall us since the end of the Second World War. It's deeply irresponsible, and our focus is on jobs, rebuilding the economy, and getting this country back on its feet. And it's really shameful that that's not the SNP's priority as well.
Kate?
They're not mutually exclusive, and ultimately you are now in a position of being anti-democratic. As Kieran Martin, who was one of the key architects of the Edinburgh Agreement, said, fear of a result is not a reason to ignore Scotland's election result. And right now, the Conservatives are fearful of the result, and so all they can say is no. Rather than presenting the positive case for the union, which I'm still to hear from Andrew or indeed any of his colleagues, they just say no, because they know they will lose. But that has fundamentally altered the union from a partnership based on consent to one that can only be protected through force of law, and that is anti-democratic.
I need to come back to you in just a moment, Kate. But first of all, Jo, when does Labour think there could be another referendum on Scottish independence?
Well, I just say what we just saw and heard really drives home why we need to focus in this election and in the 5 years ahead of us on bringing Scotland together, uniting Scotland so that it can recover from the COVID pandemic. And we're not at the end of this pandemic yet, and yet everybody's talking about referendum and constitutional issues. What needs to happen is for Scotland and the UK to spend the next 5 years recovering from a pandemic that, we've never ever experienced before. So certainly at the moment, we will fight this election on national recovery. The Parliament should be focused in Holyrood on national recovery. And that's what voters in Scotland, I think, want to hear from politicians, not old arguments, open poll divides, and going over the same arguments again and again and again.
Right, you say it's an old argument. Your leader, Keir Starmer, has said he disagrees with Boris Johnson's idea that there shouldn't be another referendum for 40 years. So if 40 years is too long, when do you think it would be reasonable?
Well, we said for the next 5 years, we should focus on recovery. That's what our election manifesto is saying. That's what we're going into this election saying in Scotland. It's what we're saying in the rest of the UK around COVID recovery. That is the most important thing for the whole of the United Kingdom. It's the most important thing in Scotland. After 5 years, I've not got a crystal ball. We'll see where we are in 5 years' time. But for the moment, the focus has to be on recovery. It shouldn't be about the old arguments and opening up all those divides that were so ugly before. We don't need to have that again, and we need to just focus on recovery.
All right, Kate, I want to turn to another important aspect of this debate, which is what currency an independent Scotland would have. In the last independence referendum in 2014, the former First Minister Alex Salmond wanted to keep the pound. But now he's saying this in The Times, which is independent Scotland needs its own currency as quickly as possible. What's the SNP policy on a new currency?
Our policy was set out a few years ago. Our policy is to introduce a Scottish currency when it is practicable to do so. But in the meantime, when
would that be? Because it is important we have a clear answer, isn't it? It is part of the election, which is key to you seeking a mandate. So when would that be?
Yeah. So our priority in the immediate aftermath of an independence referendum would be to retain the pound sterling, because your priority then is stability, building the infrastructure, making sure you have the right regulatory environment. When it is right for our economy, and indeed we set out 6 tests for what we would need to meet in terms of that currency being introduced, we would introduce our own.
So you have no clear, but there is no clear timetable on that in terms of when that would be.
No, and nor should there be, because ultimately the priority is, ironically, stability in the immediate aftermath and making sure that you still enjoy the confidence of the market. Once you've got that central bank credibility, once you have ensured that you're fit to trade, that the investment patterns allow for a new currency.
All right, well, I must let Andrew respond, listening to that.
Yeah, it's remarkable to hear Kate talking about how stability should be the priority, when she wants to inject the most dangerous impact on stability right now would be introducing another referendum on independence, and all that would mean for business investment and growth and jobs. And in terms of the currency, the simple answer is the SNP don't have a plan. Kate today has quoted at length from the Growth Commission, a report which was eschewed by the top ranks of the SNP. So unpalatable was it with so many of its members, given that it talked about deep cuts in public services and austerity and a currency union with the rest of the United Kingdom for the foreseeable future. The simple fact is that we do not need a damaging and divisive referendum at this time, with all the instability that would be caused by that. What we need to do is focus on stability, focus on recovery, focus on jobs.
OK, we're almost out of the programme. Camilla, I'm going to give you the last word. It will have to be brief. Boris Johnson campaigning in Scotland?
Well, regardless of that, I was just thinking about this whole currency thing. The point is that Britain won't share a currency with an independent Scotland, and equally the Scottish budget deficit is 8.6% compared to the UK, which is 3.9%. So how will they sustain their own currency, I think, is the question, Joe.
All right, well, we'll leave it hanging on that question. Thank you to all of my guests today. I'll be back tomorrow with PMQs at 11:15. Bye-bye.